We've talked a lot about Freud, of course, but as you can imagine, Sigmund Freud wasn't alone in the field of psychodynamic psychology. Many prominent names adorn the history of this movement, including Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, Karen Horney, Harry Sullivan, Erich Fromm, and Freud's own daughter, Anna Freud. With each new theorist, Freud's mental model and his understanding of mind and behavior and personality changed, expanded, and was, sometimes as with Carl Jung, nearly swept completely aside to allow for a very distinctive approach to understanding personality development and mental health. On the side question of the capabilities of the ego, for instance, Anna Freud departed from the ego model constructed by her father. You see, in Sigmund Freud's writing, the ego, that's the second component of the mind, and that's the component bound to work within the needs of the real world. Freud typically viewed the ego in regards to the id, the first component of the mind, and the one that sought to fulfill instinctual needs. That's the part of the mind, that's the part of your mind that Freud believed to be more powerful, more dominating. It's almost as if the mind is driven foremost by the id, and so the role of the ego is to respond to the will of the id while navigating you through reality. But at the same time, the ego is busy trying to avoid the criticism and often brutal censure of the overly moralistic superego. Sigmund Freud even went so far as to write in 1940, "The power of the id expresses the true purpose of the individual organism's life," which leaves the ego sounding like some overworked, underappreciated servant cleaning up after the messes made by the id and the superego. But for Anna Freud, the ego was much more than a slave to the id and its instinctual needs. Anna's theories of psychological development, although by and large loyal to her father's constructs, expanded on Sigmund Freud's theories with a special attention to child or developmental psychology, studying how individuals develop over time. Now, child psychology is what John Watson was looking at. Remember, he argued that by controlling the environment around the child, he could essentially condition that child to go into any profession his parents might choose. In the 1920s, the same time as Sigmund Freud, you also had the Swiss researcher Jean Piaget studying children. He argued that the origin of knowledge lay in psychology. So he began developing these intelligence tests and even building his own laboratory where he could more carefully observe and study the cognitive development of children. So yes, there were researchers out there working with children, but Sigmund Freud wasn't really one of them. Although he wrote extensively about psychological development in children, Freud had little clinical experience with kids. In fact, it would be more accurate to say that Sigmund Freud's best understood child psychology through his analysis of adult parents and what they told him about their childhoods. In contrast, Anna Freud worked closely with children. Why she would choose to do so may have had something to do with her own childhood. Anna was the sixth and last of Freud's children. In fact, her parents, Sigmund and Martha, were not expecting another child and indeed didn't really want another child when Martha became pregnant with Anna. Imagine what that must be like. I mean, to know that you were an unwanted child. Moreover, when Sigmund Freud announced the coming of another child to the Freud household, he directly said that he hoped it would be a boy, but that if it were a girl, he'd name her Anna. As Anna grew up in Freud's home, she clashed with her older siblings, especially her older sister Sophie, who was perceived to be a beautiful girl. People were always praising Sophie for being so pretty, but what did they say about Anna? Well, she's clever, you know. She's not particularly attractive, but at least she's smart. And yet, it was Anna who would follow in her father's footsteps and carry his legacy into the future. And when Sigmund Freud's health began to decline, his long drawn-out battle with cancer, in 1923, he first noticed this growth on his mouth was poorly treated. Freud's own doctor refused to tell Freud about how bad his condition was, apparently because he thought Freud might become so depressed that he might try to kill himself. And eventually, in 1939, 16 years later, and painfully dying of cancer, Freud's doctor, Max Schur, helped Sigmund Freud do just that, kill himself by administering lethal doses of morphine. But in the meantime, in those last 16 years of Freud's life, it was Anna who loyally served and represented Sigmund Freud to his colleagues during Freud's sickness. This can't have been easy for Anna. After all, Freud's colleagues were all men, old school, expecting Freud and instead getting his doctor. Anna had every reason to feel as antagonistic towards Freud's colleagues as they felt towards her, especially considering that they had won more of Freud's respect than she had. Anna was quite literally in competition with others, with the beautiful sister, with the prominent male colleagues, all of whom seemed always to have captured more of Sigmund Freud's respect and admiration than she had. In a psychological sense, in terms of personality types, Anna Freud was the ignored child seeking always to be the apple of her father's eye, and her overachievement was an effort to demonstrate to her father that she too deserved his love. Considering how defensive Anna Freud must have felt towards her own status in the Freud family, and quite likely in the still heavily male-dominated field of psychology, it's not surprising that some of her research and writings would focus on the question of threats and defenses. Her emphasis here as well was on the ego and how the ego, from childhood through adulthood, perceives threats to itself from three sources: the superego, the real world, and the impulses pursued by the id. Anna Freud studied how the ego strives to defend itself against these threats. Some of these defenses had already been identified by her father, but others she described herself. The first defense is classical Sigmund Freud, repression. Repression is a blocking or an attempt to bury in the mind something that is quite uncomfortable or even deeply painful. Remember how Freud described the emergence of the superego through a supreme act of repression, trying to block or bury the child's dangerous attraction to his or her own parent. Anna also observed acts of repression in the children she worked with. Let's consider a simple example. Imagine an adolescent girl dating a young man, a man she is sexually attracted to. There's the id. But her parents have raised her to be proper and stay away from sex. There's the superego. Her ego is overwhelmed by the guilty feelings about her sexual desire. So when the day comes when she can finally introduce her boyfriend to her parents, suddenly she can't remember her boyfriend's name. Her ego is trying to defend her from this terrible guilt by basically repressing her memories of this guy. You're innocent. You've done nothing wrong. You don't even know who this guy is, right? Repression. The second ego defense is asceticism. The term ascetic usually refers to someone who separates themselves from the physical or material world. You know, like a nun or a monk who devotes themselves to God. Asceticism as an ego defense means that the ego has become fearful of the id, afraid that an instinctual impulse, such as the sex impulse, might dominate your behavior. So the ego tries to commit as much energy as possible to a more acceptable activity, such as studying or exercising. In other words, doing whatever it can to keep you away from that scary sexual impulse. And that, Anna would argue, is why you see some guys rushing back to the gym day after day to work out, to use up all that sexual energy before they do something bad. Third, we have projection. To project is to send outward, right? Maybe from me to you, just like a projector shows a movie on a screen. Maybe I feel an impulse, a desire to do something that my ego knows is wrong, such as stealing something from a store or cheating on a test. How does my ego defend itself from this bad desire? The ego tries to downplay its own vulnerabilities to such an unacceptable impulse by projecting the same impulse onto someone else. I'm not the one who wants to cheat on the test, so it must be you. You're the real cheater, not me. A married woman who is attracted to another man might be driven by her ego to accuse her husband. It's you, not me, that wants to cheat with somebody else. You see how it works? The fourth ego defense involves turning against oneself. Sometimes we see bad things in other people. They do something that really bothers us. But when we feel critical of that person, it makes the ego feel guilty. Imagine a young woman's anger has grown towards her demanding mother so much that, out of sense of guilt, the ego begins to redirect that anger and hatred at the young woman herself. It's not my mother that's bad, it's me. I'm the bad person. Believing in the opposite is the fifth defense. Imagine a guy who spends more and more time at work, not because he wants to, but because he has to. Maybe his wife isn't working. Maybe she lost her job. Maybe she spends a lot of money shopping. So this guy is stuck working longer and longer hours. He grows resentful, angry at his wife, which makes his ego feel guilty. In fact, he feels so guilty about his anger and about how much time he's spending at work rather than at home that he lavishes great attention on his wife. He buys her presents and tells her again and again how much he loves her. Sixth, we have sublimation. Remember asceticism? A man's ego feels guilty about his strong sexual desire, so the ego throws the man into some other activities, like exercising all the time or studying hour after hour after hour every night. Well, sublimation is similar to this. The ego is fearful of the outcome of an unacceptable desire or impulse promoted by the id. So the ego tries to transform that inappropriate impulse into something that is acceptable. For example, a soldier comes back home from war and he carries within him the continued impulse to act out, to be violent, to hurt people, maybe even kill. The ego knows this is wrong, so it tries to find a new job back at home that will allow the man to do something similar, something quite physical and possibly dangerous, but which is acceptable to society, like being a police officer. Introjection, the seventh defense, involves an action that is sort of the opposite of projection. Let's say I'm feeling inadequate. unloved. Other people are more popular than I am, more loved than I am. Why should anybody care about me? I'm nobody. But maybe my ego can turn me into a somebody. If my worry is that I'm not attractive enough, then my ego tells me to go shopping. Not just for anything, but specifically for the kind of clothes and the hairstyle that a famous and attractive actor or model wears. This happens all the time, doesn't it? A famous actress or singer has a certain hairstyle, and suddenly lots and lots of women go to the hairdresser and tell the hairdresser, "Make me look just like that actress." Why would a woman do that? Isolation. Sometimes the ego decides to separate a desire from any feelings you might have related to that desire. Why? Because of guilt. Your id feels so sexually attracted to someone, but your superego says this is wrong. A sexual relationship with this person is wrong. But the superego can't stop you from having sex with this person. The id is too strong. So instead, the ego tries to separate the sex itself from any emotional attachment, becoming, in essence, cold and calculating about it. It's like the character you see in movie, the guy who's married but has sex with another woman, and when his wife finds out, he argues. "But honey, it's just sex. It doesn't mean anything. I love you." Next, the term undoing is what Anna Freud called behaviors that today might more often be referred to as obsessive. But these obsessive behaviors are mere symptoms of a deeper problem. They are defenses against undesirable or overwhelming impulses. For example, a woman works with a rather attractive man. They get along very well, but she knows he's married. The ego says to back off, but the id won't give up. So the ego has to defend itself. Whenever this woman thinks about this man, her ego sends her running to the restroom to wash her hands. The ego keeps her busy doing something clean rather than allow her to do something dirty. Finally, Anna Freud described something she called regression, something she had especially seen happen with children. Regression is turning to a behavior that one had previously outgrown, especially when faced with a high anxiety situation. For instance, imagine a 7-year-old girl who starts sucking her thumb again. At age 7, a bit too old for some thumb sucking, right? So why would she do it? Because her mother has just recently left her and her father has moved out. And this shock sends the girl into a regressive behavior, acting like a little child again, the kind of child who really needs her mother to come back home.